She thought it was a game, dropping $1,000 in front of a struggling single dad, waiting for him to fail. But when he walked straight past the cash and gave it to a church, she was frozen, stunned by what real integrity looked like. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk as Ethan Cole locked the door to his modest apartment. He turned to see Maddie bouncing on her toes, her pink backpack swaying with each movement. Despite the exhaustion weighing heavy on his shoulders from another late shift at the plant, he managed a warm smile for his daughter. "Ready for our special breakfast, sweetheart?" Ethan asked, taking her small hand in his. "Yes!" Maddie's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Can I get chocolate chip pancakes?" Ethan's heart tightened as he mentally calculated the cost. "We'll see what they have today, okay?" They walked the 3 blocks to Sally's Diner, a local establishment that had seen better days. The neon sign flickered intermittently, and the red vinyl booth showed patches where the stuffing peeked through, but it was clean, and the prices were reasonable. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. The familiar scent of coffee and bacon wrapped around them like a warm blanket. A few early morning regulars hunched over their newspapers and mugs of steaming coffee. "Well, if it isn't my favorite customers," Sally, the owner, called from behind the counter. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her smile was genuine as she watched Maddie skip toward their usual booth. Ethan slid into the worn vinyl seat across from his daughter, wincing as his back protested. The overnight shift had been particularly grueling, moving heavy equipment and scrubbing floors until they gleamed. "You look tired, honey," Sally said, approaching their table with 2 menus and a pot of coffee. "Long night," Ethan replied with a slight shrug, accepting a cup of the steaming brew. "Thank you, Sally." Maddie opened her menu with the serious concentration of a scholar studying ancient texts, even though Ethan knew she couldn't read most of the words. "Daddy, can you read the pancake part to me?" His eyes automatically went to the prices first. The chocolate chip pancakes were $8.99. His heart sank, but he kept his voice steady. "How about we split the short stack special? It comes with eggs and bacon." Maddie's face fell slightly, but she nodded bravely. "Okay, Daddy, can we share the bacon too?" "Of course, Princess." He reached across the table to tap her nose, making her giggle. As Sally took their order, Ethan noticed a well-dressed woman sitting alone in a corner booth. She seemed out of place in the humble diner, with her tailored business suit and perfectly styled silver hair. She was studying something on her tablet with intense focus, while occasionally sipping from a china teacup Sally reserved for special customers. "Daddy, look!" Maddie's excited whisper drew his attention back. She was drawing angels in the condensation on the window with her finger. "I made Mommy and her friend angels watching over us." Ethan's throat tightened. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." He watched as she added halos and wings to her finger-drawn figures, her face peaceful and content. Their breakfast arrived, and Ethan carefully divided everything into 2 portions, making sure Maddie got the slightly larger share. He watched as she savored each bite of pancake, making them last as long as possible. "Is it good?" he asked, even though he could see the answer in her happy expression. "The best." She offered him a forkful of her portion. "Try it, Daddy." He accepted the bite, making an exaggerated sound that made her laugh. The truth was, he barely tasted it, his mind already on the stack of bills waiting at home and Maddie's upcoming doctor's appointment. As they finished their meal, Ethan noticed the well-dressed woman standing up to leave. She moved with confidence, her heels clicking purposefully on the linoleum floor. As she passed their booth, something fell from her hand, an envelope that hit the floor with a soft pat. "Ma'am," Ethan called out, but she was already pushing through the door, the bell chiming her exit. He quickly slid out of the booth and picked up the envelope. Through the thin paper, he could feel what seemed to be cash inside. His heart rate quickened as he glanced through the diner's window, seeing the woman walking briskly toward a luxury car parked across the street. "What is it, Daddy?" Maddie asked, craning her neck to see. "Someone dropped something important," he replied, his mind racing. The envelope wasn't sealed, and he could see the edges of what looked like several $100 bills inside. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The weight of his unpaid bills, Maddie's medical expenses, and the constant struggle to make ends meet pressed down on him. That money could solve so many problems, at least temporarily. No one would know if he kept it. It would be so easy to simply slip it into his pocket. But then he looked at Maddie, drawing her angels on the window, and he knew he couldn't. What kind of example would that set? What would her mother have said? "Finish your pancakes, sweetheart," he said gently, gripping the envelope tightly. "I need to take care of something important." Through the window, he watched as the elegant woman reached her car, and he hurried toward the door, the envelope clutched in his hand, determined to do the right thing. Grace Whitmore sat in her black Mercedes, hands resting on the leather steering wheel as she observed the diner through tinted windows. The morning sun glinted off the restaurant's grimy windows, but she could still make out the worn-looking man and his daughter settling into their booth. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she watched them study the menu. She'd done this before these little tests of human nature. After 20 years as CEO, Grace had grown cynical about people's inherent goodness. In her experience, everyone had a price. The envelope she'd dropped contained enough cash to tempt even the most honest person, especially someone who clearly needed it. Through the window, she could see Ethan picking up the envelope with careful hands. His daughter was occupied with her coloring book, oblivious to her father's discovery. Grace leaned forward slightly, her manicured nails tapping against the steering wheel. Ethan looked around the diner, his expression troubled. He opened the envelope just enough to peek inside, and Grace noticed how his shoulders stiffened. Even from this distance, she could read the shock on his face. His hands trembled slightly as he quickly closed the envelope. "Go on," Grace murmured to herself. "We both know you're going to keep it." The words came out bitter, matching the coffee she'd left mostly untouched in the cup holder. But Ethan didn't slip the envelope into his pocket as she expected. Instead, he called over the waitress and showed her the envelope, pointing to where Grace had been sitting. The waitress shook her head, indicating she hadn't seen who might have dropped it. Grace watched as Ethan's face grew more concerned. He stood up, walking to the counter where he spoke with several other customers. Each one shook their head. His daughter looked up from her coloring, curiosity evident on her young face. "Just take it," Grace whispered, frustration creeping into her voice. "You clearly need it." She'd seen his type before: the struggling single parent, the worn clothes, the careful ordering from the cheapest part of the menu. $1,000 could make a real difference in his life. Ethan returned to his booth, the envelope still in his hands. He sat there for several long minutes, staring at it while his daughter chattered away. Grace could see the internal struggle playing across his features. Finally, he reached for a napkin and borrowed his daughter's crayon. Grace's eyebrows rose as she watched him write something. What was he doing? This wasn't part of the usual script. Then Ethan stood up, taking his daughter's hand. "Come on, Maddie." Grace could read his lips through the window. "We need to make a quick stop before I take you to school." Grace sat up straighter as Ethan and his daughter left the diner. They crossed the street, heading toward the old brick church that stood on the corner. Its white steeple reached toward the morning sky, and a simple wooden cross hung above the heavy wooden doors. She hadn't expected this. Usually, people either turned the money in immediately or pocketed it without hesitation. This was different. Ethan and Maddie climbed the worn stone steps. Grace could see him explaining something to his daughter, pointing at the donation box mounted near the entrance. The metal box was weathered but sturdy, with a small slot for offerings. Grace's throat tightened as she watched Ethan carefully fold the napkin around the envelope and slip both through the slot. The gesture was gentle, almost reverent. There was no hesitation in his movements, no last-minute doubt about giving up such a large sum of money. Maddie hugged her father's leg, and he patted her head with a smile that transformed his tired face. They turned and headed back down the steps, continuing their morning journey as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Grace sat frozen in her car, her carefully constructed worldview cracking like thin ice in spring. She had been certain that Ethan would keep the money. Every other person she'd tested had kept it. Every single one. But this man, this janitor, who probably needed the money more than most, had given it away. Not just given it away, but trusted it to God's purpose without a second thought. The cynicism that had been her companion for so many years felt suddenly heavy, like a coat that no longer fit. She looked down at her expensive watch, her designer suit, all the trappings of success that she'd used to protect herself from disappointment in humanity. For the first time in years, Grace felt something shift inside her, a small crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. She watched Ethan and his daughter disappear around the corner, their figures growing smaller until they vanished from sight. The note he'd written played in her mind, its simple words more powerful than any corporate mandate or legal contract she'd ever encountered. "Someone dropped this. I can't keep it, but I trust the Lord knows where it belongs." Grace's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee, but she couldn't bring herself to drink it. The bitter liquid seemed to match the taste of her own judgment that now sat heavy in her mouth. She had come here to prove something about human nature, to reinforce her belief that everyone could be bought at the right price. Instead, she sat in her luxury car, humbled by a janitor's unwavering integrity. The morning sun continued to climb in the sky, its warmth touching the church's steeple and making the old cross glow with an almost otherworldly light. Grace's heels clicked against the polished marble floor of her penthouse office in downtown Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city skyline, but today she barely noticed it. Her mind was still back in that small-town diner, replaying the scene she had witnessed. She shrugged off her designer blazer and draped it over the back of her ergonomic chair. The envelope she had dropped contained enough money to make most people think twice about doing the right thing. Yet that tired-looking janitor hadn't hesitated. "Jennifer?" Grace called out to her assistant through the intercom. "Bring me the personnel file on Ethan Cole from the Millbrook facility." While waiting, Grace poured herself a cup of coffee from her personal machine, a far cry from the diner's crude brew. She wrinkled her nose at the memory of that greasy spoon's atmosphere, yet something about its simplicity had felt authentic in a way her sterile office never could. Jennifer entered with a thin folder. "Here you are, Miss Whitmore. Mr. Cole has been with the company for 3 years. No incidents, perfect attendance." Grace opened the file and studied Ethan's employee photo. The camera had captured his weariness, but also a quiet dignity in his eyes. His employment history was sparse but steady. Current position, maintenance staff. Previous experience, factory work, odd jobs. Salary, barely above minimum wage. "What made you pick him?" Jennifer asked carefully. "For the test?" Grace took a slow sip of her coffee. He looked desperate enough to need the money. They all do, eventually. She set down her cup with a soft clink. "But he proved me wrong." The memory of watching him walk into that church made her chest feel tight. In her 30 years of business, she'd seen countless people compromise their integrity for far less than $1,000. She'd come to expect it, even count on it. The world made sense that way. "Pull up the security footage from the church donation box," Grace instructed. Jennifer tapped on her tablet, and the video appeared on Grace's wall screen. There was Ethan, carefully placing the envelope inside. His hands were steady, his movements deliberate. No hesitation, no glancing around to see if anyone was watching. The note he'd left was simple but profound, trusting in something bigger than himself. Grace stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city she'd conquered. Every building, every deal, every victory had come through calculating moves and leveraged advantages. She'd learned early that people would do anything for money, or power, or status. It was a language she spoke fluently, but Ethan Cole didn't seem to speak that language at all. "Jennifer," Grace said, still facing the window, "what's the status of our Millbrook facility?" "Running below capacity. There's talk of downsizing next quarter." Grace turned around. "Schedule a facility inspection for next week. I want to review operations personally." Jennifer's eyebrows rose slightly. Grace rarely visited smaller facilities, but she nodded and made the note. "And one more thing," Grace added. "There's an opening for night supervisor at the plant, correct?" "Yes. Johnson retired last month. We haven't filled the position yet." "Give it to Ethan Cole, effective immediately." Jennifer blinked. "Miss Whitmore? He hasn't applied for the position, and he doesn't have supervisory experience." "He has integrity," Grace said firmly. "That's rarer than experience. Make it happen, but keep my name out of it. As far as he's concerned, it's a routine promotion based on his work record." "Yes, ma'am." Jennifer paused at the door. "May I ask, why are you doing this?" Grace picked up Ethan's file again, studying the photo. She saw something in those tired eyes that bothered her, or maybe it was something in herself she wasn't ready to acknowledge. "Consider it an experiment," she said finally. "I want to see what happens when you reward someone's character instead of their ambition." After Jennifer left, Grace sat at her desk and pulled up the Millbrook facility's budget reports. The numbers were cold and clear, telling a story of declining profits and inevitable cuts. She thought of Ethan and his daughter in that diner, ordering the cheapest items on the menu. She opened her calendar and blocked off the following week for the facility inspection. Something about that small town, that simple church, that honest man. It tugged at memories she'd long buried. Perhaps it was time to look closer, to understand why $1,000 in an envelope had shaken her carefully constructed worldview. Grace picked up her phone and dialed her travel coordinator. "Book me a room at the Millbrook Inn for next week. Something modest." She paused. "And find out which church has a donation box near Miller's Diner." Her finger traced the edge of Ethan's file. The promotion would help him, but it was also a move in a game she didn't fully understand yet. Grace Whitmore didn't believe in divine intervention or trust or faith. She believed in power and leverage and calculated risks. But for the first time in years, she wondered if she might be wrong. Ethan stared at the corporate letter, his fingers trembling as he opened it. Maddie watched from across the table, cereal forgotten. "What is it, Daddy?" she asked. Ethan's eyes widened. He read it 3 times. "I got promoted, sweetheart." "Really?" Maddie's face lit up. "That's good, right?" "Yeah, baby. Really good. Night supervisor, better pay, better benefits. They want me to start next week." Maddie wrapped her arms around his neck. "See, angels are watching over us." Ethan hugged her back, breathing in her strawberry shampoo. The promotion meant $3 extra per hour, enough to help with Maddie's medication bills. In HR, Mrs. Jenkins smiled warmly. "Good morning, Ethan. I assume you got the letter?" "Yes, ma'am. I wanted to make sure there wasn't some mistake." She adjusted her glasses, checking his file. "No mistake. Your work record is excellent. The position comes with full benefits after 30 days, including comprehensive medical." His heart skipped. Comprehensive medical for Maddie. He took the papers with shaking hands. "Thank you. I won't let you down." Back at work, Ethan's mind wandered to possibilities. Maybe fix his truck's rattling. Perhaps start Maddie's college fund impossible just yesterday. During lunch, he called his sister. "Beth, you'll never believe what happened." Her excitement matched Maddie's. "That's wonderful. Good things happen to good people. Would you mind watching Maddie during training next week?" "Of course. I love spending time with my favorite niece." Meanwhile, Grace Whitmore watched security feeds from her temporary office. Seeing Ethan walking from HR, clutching his papers like they might disappear, she smiled. Thomas knocked. "Miss Whitmore? The promotion paperwork's processed." "Thank you. Any other updates?" Thomas hesitated. Corporate sent concerning projections. "They're talking restructuring." Grace's smile faded. "What kind?" "Significant workforce reductions, 20% across departments." "This plant's on their initial list." He handed her a tablet. "First cuts by quarter's end." Grace felt her stomach drop, thinking of Ethan's face reading the letter, his daughter believing in angels. She stared at the factory floor below, where Ethan worked with new spring in his step. The irony struck her. Her attempt to reward his integrity might have made him more vulnerable. New supervisors were often first cut in restructuring. Her test of his character had become a test of her own. The fluorescent lights of the break room hummed overhead as Ethan stared at his phone screen, reading the company-wide email for the 3rd time. His hands trembled slightly as the words "workforce reduction" and "affected positions" blurred before his eyes. The promotion he'd received just days ago now felt like a cruel joke. "Hey, Cole, you see this?" Tom from maintenance walked in, his face ashen. "They're cutting 20% of the workforce." Ethan nodded numbly, his throat tight. "Yeah, I saw it. Man, with your new position and all?" Tom shook his head. "Latest in, first out. That's usually how it goes." The truth of those words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He'd only been in the supervisor position for less than a week. His thoughts immediately went to Maddie's medication, to their rent, to the stack of medical bills sitting on his kitchen counter. His daughter's face flashed in his mind, her bright smile this morning when he'd made her favorite Mickey Mouse pancakes, even though they were running, low on syrup. "I need some air," Ethan muttered, pushing past Tom and heading for the side exit. Outside, the autumn air bit at his face. He leaned against the brick wall, trying to steady his breathing. The manufacturing plant's machinery droned on behind him, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over the years. Now it felt like a countdown timer to unemployment. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from Mrs. Jenkins, their elderly neighbor who watched Maddie after school. "Maddie's having a great day. She drew you a picture." Attached was a photo of a crayon drawing, stick figures of him and Maddie holding hands under a rainbow. His vision blurred with unshed tears. Back in his office, Ethan pulled up his resume, which hadn't been updated in years. The cursor blinked mockingly on the screen as he tried to think of what to add. His whole life had been this plant, working his way up from janitor to maintenance to his recent promotion. The thought of starting over somewhere else, especially in their small town with limited opportunities, made his stomach churn. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out Maddie's latest prescription receipt. The numbers at the bottom might as well have been written in red ink. $247.50, due next week. The promotion would have covered it easily. Now, Mr. Cole? His secretary, Barbara, poked her head in. There's a meeting for all supervisors in the main conference room in 5 minutes. Ethan straightened his tie, a Christmas gift from Maddie last year. Thanks, Barbara. The conference room was already half full when he arrived. The plant manager, Mr. Richardson, stood at the front, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by something more somber. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. As you've all seen from the email, Richardson began, corporate has mandated significant workforce reductions across all facilities. We'll be receiving the preliminary list of affected positions tomorrow morning. Murmurs rippled through the room. Someone coughed nervously. I know this is difficult news, Richardson continued. We'll be conducting individual meetings throughout the week. HR will be available for consultations, and we'll be providing information about severance packages and job placement assistance. Ethan barely heard the rest of the meeting. His mind was already racing through contingency plans. He could pick up night shifts at the gas station, maybe see if the local mechanic needed help on weekends. They could move to a smaller apartment, though they were already in one of the cheapest units in town. After the meeting, he called the pharmacy to ask about generic alternatives for Maddie's medication. The pharmacist's sympathetic voice only made him feel worse. I'm sorry, Mr. Cole, but for this particular medication, there isn't a generic option available yet. Meanwhile, in her corner office in the city, Grace Whitmore sat at her desk, staring at the preliminary layoff list on her computer screen. Her finger traced down the names until it stopped at Cole, Ethan, night supervisor, plant operations. The cursor hovered over his name as she remembered his act of kindness with the envelope, the quiet dignity in his movements as he'd placed it in the church donation box. She pulled up his employee file. Single father, consistent performance reviews, perfect attendance record. The promotion she'd arranged had bumped him into a higher pay grade, and ironically, into a more vulnerable position during the restructuring. Grace stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. The setting sun painted the glass buildings in shades of orange and gold, but she barely noticed. Her chest felt tight with an unfamiliar emotion. Was it guilt? She'd spent years making tough business decisions, signing off on layoffs and closures without a second thought. Why did this one name on a list affect her so deeply? She thought of the little girl she'd seen with him at the diner, her small hand tucked trustingly in his. The same age her Sarah would have been if Grace pushed that thought away quickly, as she always did. Her intercom buzzed. Miss Whitmore, the board is waiting for you in the conference room. Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes, she responded automatically. Returning to her desk, Grace stared at Ethan's name again. Her carefully orchestrated test of character had backfired spectacularly. In trying to reward his honesty, she'd inadvertently put him in an even more precarious position. The irony wasn't lost on her. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out the envelope she'd retrieved from the church's donation box, the same $1,000 she'd dropped, along with Ethan's handwritten note about trusting the Lord. The paper was worn now from how many times she'd unfolded and read it. The intercom buzzed again. Miss Whitmore? Yes, I'm coming, she said, slipping the envelope back into her drawer. Grace gathered her papers for the board meeting, but her mind was already working on a different problem. There had to be a way to fix this without drawing attention to her involvement. She'd built her career on finding solutions to complex problems. This was just another puzzle to solve, but as she walked toward the conference room, she knew this was different. For the first time in years, the outcome mattered to her on a personal level. The question was, how far was she willing to go to help a man who'd shown her that genuine goodness still existed in the world? The digital clock on Ethan's nightstand blinked 2:17 a.m., its red numbers casting a dim glow across his sparse bedroom. He lay on his back, hands folded across his chest, staring at the ceiling where shadows from passing cars danced like restless ghosts. The sound of Maddie's gentle breathing from the next room usually brought him peace, but tonight it only heightened his worry. His mind wandered to the stack of bills on the kitchen counter. The electric company's final notice glared at him in bright red letters. Maddie's latest prescription had already stretched his credit card to its limit. The rent was due in 5 days, and his landlord, Mr. Peterson, had made it clear there would be no more grace periods. Ethan rolled onto his side, punching his pillow in frustration. The promotion had felt like an answer to prayer, a small miracle that could help them get ahead. Now it seemed more like a setup for an even bigger fall. His thoughts drifted to the envelope he'd found at the diner. $1,000. The amount still made his stomach clench. It would have covered Maddie's medication for 2 months. Lord, he whispered into the darkness, I know you have a plan, but I could really use some direction right now. A car alarm went off somewhere in the distance, and Ethan got up. Knowing sleep wouldn't come, he padded quietly to the kitchen, careful not to wake Maddie. The linoleum floor felt cold under his bare feet as he made his way to the coffee maker. Even though it was the middle of the night, he needed something to do with his hands. While the coffee brewed, he pulled out his worn notebook and started doing calculations he'd already done a dozen times. Maybe he'd missed something, some hidden reserve of money he'd forgotten about. But the numbers didn't lie. Without this job, they'd be out of options in less than a month. The coffee maker sputtered its last drops, and Ethan poured himself a cup, breathing in the familiar aroma. Through the kitchen window, he could see the old maple tree in their small backyard, its leaves beginning to turn golden in the streetlight. Maddie loved that tree. She'd named it Mr. Whispers because of the sound its leaves made in the breeze. Daddy? Ethan turned to find Maddie standing in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. Her favorite stuffed rabbit dangled from one hand. Hey, sweetheart, he said softly. What are you doing up? I heard noises. She shuffled over to him in her pink pajamas. Are you okay? Ethan lifted her onto his lap, wrapping his arms around her small frame. Just couldn't sleep, that's all. Is it because of work? Her blue eyes, so much like her mother's, looked up at him with concern beyond her years. Don't you worry about that, he said, forcing a smile. That's grown-up stuff. Maddie leaned her head against his chest. Mommy always said angels watch over us when we sleep. Ethan's throat tightened. She did say that, didn't she? Maybe you need an angel right now, Daddy. He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the sweet smell of her strawberry shampoo. Maybe I do, sweetie. Maybe I do. Across town, in her penthouse office, Grace Whitmore sat at her desk, surrounded by financial reports and employee records. The city lights twinkled below, but she barely noticed them. Her focus was fixed on the image on her computer screen, Ethan Cole's personnel file. The numbers don't lie, Grace. Richard Barnes, her CFO, said from the video conference window, we need to cut 15% of the workforce to maintain profitability. And there's no other way? Grace asked, even though she already knew the answer. Not if we want to keep the shareholders happy. Sandra Chin, her HR director, chimed in from another window. The plant's efficiency ratings are the lowest in our network. Grace minimized the video chat windows and stared at Ethan's file again. His performance reviews were stellar. His attendance record was perfect. But he was one of the newest supervisors, which put him squarely on the chopping block. She thought about the envelope she'd dropped, about watching him walk into that church. In all her years of testing people's character, she'd never seen anyone pass so completely, so unconsciously. It hadn't been a show for anyone's benefit. He hadn't known anyone was watching. Grace? Richard's voice pulled her back. We need your sign-off on the final list. She reached for her mouse, then stopped. With a few clicks, she could save Ethan's job. She could move numbers around, create a special project position, find a way to justify keeping him. It would be easy. She was CEO, after all. But was that the right thing to do? Was she letting her emotions cloud her judgment? Grace had built her career on making tough, logical decisions. She'd learned early on that mixing business with sentiment was dangerous. Give me until morning, she said finally. I want to review the numbers one more time. After ending the call, Grace walked to her office window. The city stretched out before her, a maze of lights and shadows. Somewhere out there, a single father was probably lying awake, worried about his future, while his daughter slept peacefully, unaware of the power Grace held over their lives. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass. The woman who had dropped that envelope wanted to test a stranger's honesty. Now she found herself being tested in return, caught between her head and her heart, between business and compassion, between the person she'd become and the person she might still be. The morning sun filtered through Grace's corner office windows, casting shadows across her mahogany desk. She sat with fingers hovering over her keyboard, usually decisive nature wavering. The layoff list glowed on her screen. Ethan Cole's name halfway down. Grace sipped cold coffee and grimaced. The bitter taste matched her mood as she contemplated her next move, having spent the morning reviewing personnel files, searching for ways to justify keeping Ethan employed. "Miss Whitmore?" Sarah knocked softly. "The regional managers are waiting." Grace straightened her blazer. "Thank you. Could you bring the productivity reports from last quarter? Specifically, maintenance department." In the conference room, Grace faced 8 expectant managers around the large table. "Before we finalize the layoffs, I want to review departmental metrics," Grace began, accepting reports from Sarah. "These numbers show interesting patterns in maintenance efficiency, particularly Plant 47. Ethan's facility?" Marcus Chin leaned forward. "Maintenance costs there decreased 12% since last quarter." "Exactly. Equipment downtime reduced significantly. The night supervisor position is paying off." Grace watched her team review the highlighted figures. The numbers were real. Ethan's promotion had genuinely improved operations. She was ensuring these facts weren't overlooked. "Perhaps we should reconsider maintenance staff cuts," suggested Patricia Rodriguez. Given these positive results, Grace maintained professional demeanor, heart lifting. "I agree. Let's review, department by department." The 2-hour meeting saw Grace guide discussion with subtle precision, never mentioning Ethan directly, but protecting key maintenance positions. Several names disappeared from the layoff list, including Ethan's. Back in her office, Grace felt relieved, yet uneasy. She'd achieved her goal, but victory felt hollow. Would Ethan appreciate her interference, or see it as manipulation from a rich executive playing with people's lives? She thought about the cash envelope, her initial test. Ethan's integrity had surprised her, donating the money rather than keeping it for his struggling family. Now she was making choices affecting his life without his knowledge. At Plant 47, Ethan sat in the break room, pushing food around his plate. Job uncertainty had killed his appetite. Around him, employees spoke in hushed tones about impending layoffs. Cole, his supervisor Mike, appeared. "Got a minute?" Ethan's stomach clenched as he followed Mike, preparing for the worst, calculating how long his savings would last. Not long enough. "Just got word from corporate," Mike said. "They've finished reviewing the layoff list." Ethan gripped his chair, knuckles white, thinking of Maddie, medical bills, his promise to always care for their daughter. "You're safe," Mike smiled. "Your position's secured. They specifically mentioned maintenance efficiency improvements since you took over night supervision." Relief flooded through Ethan so intensely it made him dizzy. He barely heard Mike's continued explanation about restructuring. All he could think was that somehow, against all odds, he could keep providing for Maddie. Later, walking his rounds, Ethan paused by windows overlooking the parking lot. Afternoon sun warmed his face. He wasn't a man who believed in miracles. Life taught him everything had a price. But standing there, job secure, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. He pulled out his phone, looking at Maddie's photo background. Her smile, so much like her mother's, seemed brighter. He wouldn't have to tell her they were moving or cutting back further. For now, they were okay. Grace signed the final layoff paperwork. Her signature flowed with usual confidence, but her heart felt heavy with secret intervention. She'd done the right thing, protecting a good man's job based on real improvements. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling she was walking a fine line between help and manipulation. She closed the folder, handing it to Sarah. Decisions made, paper signed, no going back. Grace turned to her window, watching afternoon sun descend behind city towers. Somewhere out there, Ethan was probably feeling relieved, grateful for what seemed a fortunate turn. She hoped someday, if he learned the truth, he'd understand why she'd intervened. The industrial hum of machinery filled the air as Grace Whitmore made her way through the manufacturing plant. Her heels clicked against the concrete floor, drawing brief glances from workers before they quickly returned to their tasks. She hadn't announced her visit. She preferred to see things as they really were, not the polished version usually presented to executives. The plant manager, Mike Stevens, walked beside her, rattling off production, numbers, and efficiency ratings. Grace nodded occasionally, but her attention was elsewhere. She scanned the busy floor, looking for one particular face among the many. "And our night shift productivity has increased by 12% since," Mike continued. "Who's that?" Grace interrupted, gesturing toward a figure in navy work clothes, methodically checking gauges on a large piece of equipment. "Oh, that's Ethan Cole, one of our newer supervisors," Mike replied. "Good worker, very reliable." Grace watched as Ethan moved with quiet purpose, stopping to help a younger worker adjust some settings. His movements were careful, deliberate. Even from a distance, she could see the patience in his manner as he explained something to his colleague, pointing at different parts of the machine. "He seems to know what he's doing," Grace observed, keeping her voice neutral. "Yes, ma'am. He's got a natural understanding of the equipment. Started as a janitor, but he's always had a knack for fixing things." Grace stepped closer, staying behind a row of storage containers. Ethan was checking a clipboard now, his brow furrowed in concentration. There was something compelling about his focus, the way he carried himself with dignity, despite the grease on his hands and the worn patches on his uniform. A young worker approached Ethan with what appeared to be a problem. Grace watched as Ethan's serious expression softened, a gentle smile appearing as he listened. He placed a reassuring hand on the worker's shoulder before following him to another station. "He's good with the team," Mike commented, "especially the newer ones. Takes time to teach them properly." Grace nodded, remembering the note she'd found in the church donation box. The same care and integrity she'd witnessed that day was evident in everything Ethan did. "Tell me about his background," she said, moving behind a large column as Ethan walked past, still deep in conversation with the young worker. Mike shifted, uncomfortably. "Well, he's a single father. His wife passed away a few years back, terrible accident during that big tornado. She was a nurse, stayed behind at the hospital to help evacuate patients." Grace felt something tighten in her chest. She watched as Ethan demonstrated proper safety protocols to the younger worker, his movements precise and protective. "His daughter," Mike continued, lowering his voice, "she's got some health issues, heart condition, I think. He never complains, but everyone knows he works extra shifts whenever he can." Grace thought about the layoff list sitting on her desk, Ethan's name among those marked for termination. She'd already quietly arranged to have it removed, but now, seeing him in person, understanding more about his life, she felt the weight of her earlier test more heavily than ever. "Let's continue the tour," she said abruptly, turning away from the production floor. They walked through several corridors, Mike pointing out various improvements and upgrades. Grace was only half listening, her mind still on Ethan and his daughter. She rounded a corner, lost in thought, and nearly collided with someone coming the other way. "Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am," a familiar voice said. Grace looked up to find herself face to face with Ethan Cole. Up close, she could see the flecks of gray in his dark hair, the tired lines around his eyes, but also the warmth in his expression. His name badge was slightly crooked on his chest pocket, and there was a small coffee stain on his sleeve. "No, it's my fault," Grace said quickly. "I wasn't watching where I was going." Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. Grace saw kindness in his gaze, the same pure goodness she'd witnessed that day at the church. There was something else too, a quiet strength that made her usual corporate armor feel suddenly heavy and unnecessary. Ethan gave a polite nod, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes that made Grace, I wonder if he remembered her from the diner. "Excuse me," he said, stepping aside to let them pass. As they moved past each other, Grace caught a whiff of coffee and machine oil, and beneath that, something that reminded her of autumn leaves and church pews. She felt strangely unsettled, as if something fundamental had shifted in her carefully ordered world. "Mr. Cole," Mike called after him, "how's that new calibration system working out?" "Much better now, sir," Ethan replied, turning back briefly. "Just finished training the third shift on it." His eyes met Grace's once more, and she felt that same unexpected warmth. Then he was gone, disappearing down the corridor with his clipboard tucked under his arm. Grace stood there for a moment, her usual sharp focus scattered. The simple interaction had left her feeling both more certain and more confused than ever. She'd come to observe him, to validate her decision to save his job, but she hadn't expected to feel this connection. "Shall we continue to the shipping department?" Mike asked, gesturing toward another hallway. "Actually," Grace said, straightening her jacket, "I think I've seen enough for today." She needed time to think, to figure out what to do next. The man she'd tried to test had ended up teaching her something instead, and she wasn't quite sure what to do with that knowledge. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of First Baptist Church, casting kaleidoscope patterns across the wooden pews. Grace Whitmore slipped into the back row just as the first hymn began. She smoothed her simple navy dress, feeling oddly out of place without her usual power suit. It had been years since she'd attended a service, and the familiar scent of old hymnals and wood polish brought back memories she'd long buried. Several rows ahead, she spotted Ethan and Maddie Cole. The little girl wore a pink dress with white ribbons in her hair, swaying slightly to the music while holding her father's hand. Ethan stood tall, his voice joining the congregation in amazing grace. Even from behind, Grace could see the quiet dignity in his bearing, so different from the calculated confidence she encountered in her corporate world. The pastor, a silver-haired man named Reverend Thomas, stepped up to the pulpit. His weathered face creased into welcoming smile lines as he began his sermon. "Today, we're going to talk about forgiveness," he announced, his voice warm and inviting. Not just receiving it, but giving it. Grace shifted in her seat, suddenly uncomfortable. She opened the Bible in her lap, more for something to do with her hands than anything else. The leather cover was cool against her fingers. "Forgiveness isn't just a gift we give others," Reverend Thomas continued. "It's a gift we give ourselves. When we hold on to hurt, on to judgment, on to pride, we're the ones who suffer most." The words seemed to float directly to Grace, wrapping around her like a gentle rebuke. She thought of all the times she'd tested people, expecting the worst, finding satisfaction in being proved right about human nature. But Ethan had broken that pattern, hadn't he? Maddie's small cough drew Grace's attention. She watched as Ethan immediately reached into his pocket, pulled out a small pill bottle, and handed his daughter water from a worn plastic bottle. The tenderness in his movements made Grace's throat tighten. The sermon continued, but Grace found herself lost in observation. She noticed how Ethan helped an elderly woman find her place in the hymnal, how he squeezed Maddie's shoulder when she fidgeted too much, how he nodded thoughtfully at the pastor's words about grace and second chances. "We're all broken in some way," Reverend Thomas's voice resonated through the church. "But it's through our brokenness that light gets in. It's through our mistakes that we learn compassion." Grace's hands clenched in her lap. She thought about the envelope of money she dropped, about orchestrating Ethan's promotion only to have it threatened by layoffs, about her secret intervention to save his job. Had she been testing him, or had she been the one being tested all along? The service drew to a close with another hymn. Grace remained seated as the congregation began to move, waiting for the crowd to thin before making her exit. She watched Ethan help Maddie into her little coat, the girl chattering animatedly about something that made her father smile. Just as Grace thought she could slip out unnoticed, a high-pitched voice called out, "Hello!" She turned to find Maddie Cole standing there, her bright eyes shining with innocent curiosity. Grace's heart jumped. She hadn't expected direct contact, hadn't prepared for it. "I'm Maddie," the little girl announced, smoothing her pink dress importantly. "Are you new here? Daddy says we should always welcome new people." Grace glanced around quickly, but Ethan was engaged in conversation with another church member several feet away. "Yes," she managed to say softly, "I'm new." Maddie's face lit up with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire church. "I knew it. You know what? I think you're one of them." "One of what?" Grace asked, finding herself drawn into the child's earnest conversation despite her reservations. "One of the angels Mommy sends to help Daddy," Maddie whispered conspiratorially. "She's in heaven now, but she makes sure we're okay. Sometimes she sends special people." The girl reached out and touched Grace's hand gently. "Your hands are soft, just like angel wings would be." Grace felt something crack inside her chest, a wall she'd built years ago beginning to crumble. The pure faith in Maddie's eyes, the complete absence of cynicism or doubt, struck her with an almost physical force. I'm not." Grace started to protest, but Maddie just smiled wider. "It's okay. Angels don't always know they're angels. That's what Pastor Thomas says. Sometimes they're just good. People doing good things because God puts it in their hearts." Before Grace could respond, Maddie gave her a quick, spontaneous hug. The gesture was so unexpected, so genuine, that Grace found herself blinking back tears. The little girl's arms were warm and trusting, her small frame surprisingly strong despite her medical condition. "Maddie?" Ethan's voice called from across the room. "Where did you go, sweetheart?" "Coming, Daddy," Maddie called back. She gave Grace one last smile. "I hope you come back next Sunday. Angels are always welcome here." Grace watched as the little girl skipped back to her father, her pink dress bouncing with each step. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stand there, overwhelmed by the pure love and faith she'd just encountered. In all her years of testing people's character, of looking for the worst in humanity, she'd never expected to be undone by the simple trust of a child who saw angels where Grace had only seen opportunities for judgment. When she finally walked out of the church into the bright Sunday morning, Grace knew something fundamental had shifted inside her. The warm spring air touched her face like a benediction, carrying with it the weight of possibility, and perhaps, just perhaps, the whisper of wings. The manufacturing plant stood quiet in the fading daylight, most workers having left for home. Grace walked down the dimly lit corridor, her heels clicking against the concrete floor. She found Ethan in his office, really just a small room with a metal desk and filing cabinet, reviewing maintenance schedules for the night shift. "Mr. Cole?" Grace's voice was softer than her usual commanding tone. "Do you have a moment?" Ethan looked up, surprise crossing his tired features. "Miss Whitmore?" "Of course." He quickly stood, straightening his work shirt. "Is everything all right?" Grace gestured for him to sit back down as she took the chair across from his desk. "Everything's fine. She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I wanted to check in, see how you're adjusting to the supervisor position." "I appreciate that." Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly, but wariness remained in his eyes. "It's been a learning curve, but I'm grateful for the opportunity." Grace nodded, noting the dark circles under his eyes. "You're working late again, just trying to stay ahead." He gave a small, self-conscious laugh. "Single-parent life doesn't leave much room for falling behind. How long have you been doing it on your own?" The question slipped out before Grace could stop herself. Ethan's fingers absently touched the wedding ring he still wore. 3 years now. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the family photo on his desk. "Sarah, my wife, she was a nurse at Memorial Hospital. There was a tornado that hit the hospital. She stayed behind to help evacuate patients." Grace's chest tightened. "I'm so sorry. She always put others first." Pride and pain mingled in his voice. "Maddie was only 4 then. Sometimes I look at her and see so much of Sarah, the same kindness, the same spirit. It must be challenging, raising her alone." "It is." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "But Maddie, she makes it worth every second, even with all the medical bills and appointments." Grace leaned forward slightly. "Medical bills?" "Maddie has a heart condition." His voice grew quieter. "She needs regular treatments, medications. The insurance helps, but..." He shook his head. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't be burdening you with all this." "No, please." Grace said quickly. "I asked, and I want to understand." Something in her tone made Ethan look at her more closely. He seemed to be weighing how much to share. "The hardest part isn't even the financial stuff," he continued slowly. "It's the moments when she asks about her mom, or when she's scared before a procedure, and I have to be strong for her. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough, being enough." Grace's hands tightened in her lap. "From what I've seen, you're doing a remarkable job." "That's kind of you to say." Ethan smiled slightly. "But some days, it feels like I'm barely keeping my head above water. Maddie deserves so much more than I can give her." "Children need love more than anything else," Grace said softly. "And that's clearly something you give in abundance." Ethan nodded, emotion flickering across his face. "I try. Every day, I try." He cleared his throat. "You know, it's funny, Maddie. She has this theory that her mom sends angels to watch over us. Every time something good happens, she says it's one of Sarah's angels." Grace felt her throat constrict. What a beautiful way to see the world. "Yeah," Ethan agreed. "I wish I had her faith sometimes. But someone has to be practical, right?" He gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. Grace struggled to keep her voice steady. "Sometimes help comes from unexpected places." "Maybe?" Ethan glanced at his watch. "I should probably head home. Maddie's babysitter needs to leave by 7. "Of course." Grace stood, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you for sharing with me, Mr. Cole. I know it couldn't have been easy." "Thank you for listening, Miss Whitmore." Ethan rose as well. "It's not often I talk about these things. But somehow," he paused, "it felt right." Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As she walked to the door, Ethan called after her, "Miss Whitmore?" She turned. "Yes?" "I appreciate you taking an interest. It means a lot that someone in your position would care about an employee's personal life." Grace felt the weight of her secrets press against her chest. If he only knew how much she'd already intervened in his life. Instead, she managed a small smile and left. Her heels echoing down the empty corridor as she fought back tears. Grace sat in her home office, staring at her computer screen. The glow from the monitor illuminated her face in the darkness, showing the deep lines of concentration around her eyes. She had spent hours researching Maddie's medical condition, reviewing treatment options, and calculating costs. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she accessed her private banking portal. The amount needed for Maddie's treatment made her pause, not because it was too much for her wealth, but because she knew how life-changing it would be for the Coles. She thought back to the church service, remembering Maddie's bright smile and unwavering faith. The little girl's words echoed in her mind. "Mommy sends angels to help Daddy." With determined keystrokes, Grace arranged the transfer through a series of charitable foundations she had established years ago. She made sure the money would be untraceable, appearing as an anonymous donation to the hospital specifically designated for Maddie's care. Her heart raced as she clicked "Confirm." The next morning, Ethan sat in the hospital's billing department, his worn leather wallet in his lap. He had come prepared to beg for another payment extension, rehearsing his plea on the drive over. The billing specialist, Mrs. Thompson, called him in with an unusually bright smile. "Mr. Cole," she said, adjusting her reading glasses, "I have some extraordinary news." She turned her computer screen toward him. "An anonymous donor has covered Maddie's entire treatment plan." Ethan stared at the screen, his mouth falling open. The numbers didn't make sense at first. Where there had been overwhelming debt, there was now a zero balance. His hands began to shake. This must be a mistake," he whispered. Mrs. Thompson shook her head. "No mistake. The donation came through proper channels. Everything's been verified." She reached across her desk and touched his arm gently. "Sometimes miracles do happen, Mr. Cole." Ethan drove home in a daze, his vision blurring with tears he couldn't hold back. He pulled into the parking lot of their apartment building and sat there, letting the engine idle. Who would do this? Who even knew about their situation? He thought about the church community, but knew none of them had this kind of money. When he picked Maddie up from school that afternoon, she noticed something different about him right away. "Daddy, why are you smiling so much?" He knelt down and hugged her tight. "Baby girl, something wonderful happened today. Someone very special has helped us with your medical bills." Maddie's eyes widened. "Was it an angel, Daddy? Like Mommy promised?" Ethan felt his throat tighten. "You know what, sweetheart? Maybe it was." Over the next few weeks, Maddie's health showed marked improvement. With the financial burden lifted, she could receive all her prescribed medications without interruption. Her color improved and her energy levels increased. Ethan watched in amazement as his daughter grew stronger each day. At work, Ethan threw himself into his duties with renewed vigor. The night shift, which had once felt like a burden, now felt like a blessing. He took on extra responsibilities, mentored new employees, and even started taking maintenance certification courses offered by the company. One evening, as he was checking the equipment logs, he found himself talking to Mary, the elderly cleaning woman who had worked at the plant for decades. "I just wish I knew who to thank," he said, helping her move some supplies. "It feels strange, being grateful to someone you can't even see." Mary smiled knowingly. "Sometimes the best gifts come without a name, son. That way we learn to be thankful for the blessing itself, not just the person behind it." Ethan nodded, thinking about her words. He started keeping a small notebook in his pocket, jotting down all the improvements he noticed in Maddie. Her stronger appetite, her longer periods of play without getting tired, the way she could now climb the stairs to their apartment without stopping to rest. Each night before bed, he would read these notes to himself, using them as a reminder that even in the darkest times, light could break through. The mysterious gift hadn't just saved Maddie's health, it had restored his faith in possibilities. Grace watched these changes from afar. She saw how Ethan carried himself differently now, noticed the spring in his step as he walked through the plant. During their occasional brief encounters, she observed how his eyes shone with new purpose, how his smile came more easily. Though she ached to tell him the truth, she knew that some gifts were more powerful when given in silence. One afternoon, she overheard him talking to a coworker in the break room about Maddie's progress. "The doctors say her heart function has improved significantly," he was saying, his voice full of quiet joy. "They're amazed by how well she's responding to the treatment." Grace slipped away before she could be noticed, her own heart full. She had spent years making calculated business decisions, measuring everything in terms of profit and loss. But this felt different. This felt right. Ethan ended each day by stopping at the church where he had left that envelope of money months ago. He would sit in the quiet sanctuary for a few minutes, offering silent thanks for the mysterious benefactor who had changed their lives. Sometimes, he would bring Maddie with him, and they would light a candle together. "Do you think our angel knows how much better I feel, Daddy?" Maddie asked one evening as they sat in the wooden pew. "I'm sure they do, sweetheart," Ethan replied, pulling her close. "I'm sure they do." The weight that had been crushing him for so long had lifted, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, real, tangible hope. Whatever tomorrow might bring, he knew now that they weren't alone in their struggle. Someone, somewhere, had seen their need and responded with extraordinary kindness. The community center buzzed with warmth as people arrived carrying covered dishes. Streamers hung from the ceiling, and children's thank you cards decorated the walls. The aroma of home-cooked meals filled the air. Casseroles, fresh bread, and Mary Thompson's famous apple pie. Grace slipped through the side door in a simple blue dress, having left her designer clothes and pearls at home. Her hair was pulled back modestly, minimal makeup applied. Here, she wasn't Grace Whitmore, CEO, just another community member. She found a spot near the back, heart racing as she watched familiar faces from the plant mingle with church members and townspeople. Everyone who entered, regardless of their means, brought something to share. Mrs. Jenkins, on her fixed income, brought cornbread. The Wilson family with 5 children carried a huge pot of chili. This community's instinct to give, even with so little, touched something deep inside Grace. Then, Ethan walked in with Maddie. Grace's breath caught. Maddie wore a yellow dress with ribbon in her hair, looking healthier than ever. The circles under her eyes had faded, her cheeks glowed rosy. She skipped alongside her father, chattering excitedly, but Ethan truly captured Grace's attention. Gone was the worried furrow, the shoulder tension. He stood straighter, smiled easier in his clean button-down and khakis. Grace's chest tightened, realizing she'd helped create this transformation. Pastor Mike called for attention. "Friends, we're here to celebrate a miracle. Someone has shown extraordinary generosity to one of our families." Grace shifted uncomfortably. She hadn't expected such public acknowledgement. "Ethan, would you like to say something?" Ethan stepped forward, holding Maddie's hand. "I'm not much for public speaking," he began, voice rough with emotion, "but I need to say thank you to whoever you are. You've given my daughter a chance at a normal life. You've given me back my hope." Maddie tugged his hand and he smiled down. "Would you like to say something, sweetheart?" The little girl nodded and stepped forward. "Thank you, Angel," she said clearly. "Daddy says you want to stay secret, but that's okay because angels are supposed to be invisible sometimes. I drew you a picture." She held up a crayon drawing of 3 figures, a tall one with wings, a medium-sized one, and a small one holding hands. Grace felt tears welling. "The doctors say my heart is getting stronger. I can play at recess now, and I don't get tired. Daddy doesn't look scared when he tucks me in." Grace pressed her hand to her mouth. Around her, people sniffled and wiped their eyes. Ethan wrapped his arm around Maddie's shoulders. "We don't know who you are," Ethan continued, "but you've changed our lives. Not just with the money, though that's made all the difference with Maddie's treatment. You've reminded us there are still people who care, who give without asking for anything. You've given us back our faith in miracles." The room erupted in applause. Grace wanted to stand, reveal herself, embrace them both, but she remained rooted, a stranger celebrating her own kindness. As people lined up for food, Grace watched Ethan and Maddie move through the crowd, accepting hugs and well wishes. She saw how Ethan's smile never wavered, how he ensured Maddie said her please and thank yous. Grace barely touched her food, absorbed in watching them. She felt simultaneously part of this gathering and separate from it. She'd created this joy but couldn't fully participate. The weight of her deception, the dropped envelope, the test, felt heavier than ever. Maddie's drawing had been pinned to the bulletin board. The angel figure wore a blue dress, just like Grace's. Coincidence? Or did Maddie somehow know more? The evening continued with laughter and conversation, but Grace remained in her corner, watching them move through the crowd. She wanted to approach, share their joy directly, but couldn't find courage. How could she explain her presence? How could she justify her actions without revealing everything? So she sat quietly, witnessing the happiness she'd helped create, feeling both blessed and burdened by her secret role. Grace watched from her corner as Ethan worked his way through the crowd, stopping to chat with neighbors and accept their warm wishes. Maddie skipped alongside him, her cheeks rosy with health, clutching a paper plate loaded with desserts. The sight made Grace's chest tight with emotion. The truth revealed itself in the most ordinary way. Sarah, one of the church volunteers, happened to mention seeing Grace's town car outside the hospital administration building on the day Maddie's treatment was approved. That fancy black car with the company logo, she said loudly enough for Ethan to hear, just like the one that's always at the plant. Grace saw the exact moment understanding dawned in Ethan's eyes. He turned slowly, scanning the room until his gaze found her in her quiet corner. The recognition that crossed his face was like a physical thing. Surprise, then gratitude, then something else. Confusion, hurt. She watched his shoulders tense as he whispered something to Mrs. Thompson, who took Maddie's hand. Then he started making his way toward her, weaving between folding chairs and conversation circles. Grace's heart hammered. She had imagined this moment, but now that it was here, she felt exposed, vulnerable. The carefully constructed walls of her corporate persona seemed paper-thin. "It was you," Ethan said quietly when he reached her. Not a question. His voice was steady, but she could see the turbulent emotions in his eyes. The hospital bills, the promotion, all of it. Grace nodded, unable to find words. The noise of the potluck seemed to fade away, leaving them in their own quiet bubble of tension. "Why?" he asked. "Why go through all this? Secrecy?" She gestured to an empty classroom down the hall, away from the crowd. Ethan followed her, his movements stiff with uncertainty. The classroom was dim, lit only by the evening sun through dusty windows. Children's artwork decorated the walls, bright splashes of crayon and hope. "I wanted to help," Grace said finally, her voice softer than usual. Without what? Ethan's tone wasn't angry, just tired, confused. "Without letting me know who was pulling the strings?" Grace flinched at his choice of words. "That's not what I meant to do." "Then what did you mean to do?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Because, from where I'm standing, it feels like I've been part of some kind of experiment." First, the envelope at the diner. Grace's eyes widened. "You knew about that?" "I didn't, not until now. But I remember that day clearly, and now it all makes sense." He leaned against a student desk, looking suddenly weary. "You were testing me, weren't you?" The shame Grace felt was unfamiliar and uncomfortable. "Yes," she admitted. "At first, that's what it was. A test. I've seen so much dishonesty in my position, so much greed, I thought." She trailed off, realizing how hollow her justification sounded. "You thought you'd play games with someone's life?" The edge in his voice was sharp but controlled. "Do you know what that money could have meant for Maddie's treatment? For our lives?" "I know," Grace whispered. "And that's exactly why what you did that day changed everything. You took that envelope straight to the church. You didn't even hesitate." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, processing. So then all this, the help with Maddie's treatment, the promotion, was what? Reward for passing your test? "No," Grace said firmly. "Well, maybe at first. But then I got to know you, got to know Maddie. I saw how hard you work, how much you sacrifice. It stopped being about tests or rewards. She struggled to find the right words. "I just wanted to help." The silence between them grew heavy with unspoken thoughts. Outside the classroom, they could hear the muffled sounds of the potluck continuing. Laughter, the clink of plates, the gestures, murmur of conversation. "I'm grateful," Ethan said finally. "For Maddie's sake, I'm more grateful than I can say. But I need to know, was any of it real? Our conversations at the plant, the time you've spent with Maddie at Sunday school? All of it," Grace replied, immediately. "Every moment was real. More real than anything in my life has felt in a very long time." She took a deep breath. "Kindness isn't just about giving money, Ethan. Sometimes it's about letting people into your life, even when it scares you. You taught me that." Ethan studied her face for a long moment, as if searching for any trace of deception. "I want to trust you," he said slowly. "But you have to understand, I can't have anyone playing games with my daughter's feelings." "Or mine." "I understand," Grace said softly. "And I promise you, no more games, no more tests, just kindness." Simple as that. Through the classroom window, they could see Maddie in the main room, showing off her new dress to her Sunday school friends. Her laughter carried faintly through the walls, pure and bright. The autumn wind whistled through the trees outside the manufacturing plant as Ethan sat in his small office, staring at the paperwork in front of him. His mind kept drifting back to Grace's confession. Each time he thought about it, his stomach twisted into tighter knots. He picked up his phone and looked at the text message Grace had sent him earlier. "Can we talk?" He set it back down without responding. The promotion, the saved job, Maddie's medical bills. It all made sense now. Every piece of good fortune had been orchestrated by Grace Whitmore, the CEO who had tested him with that envelope of cash months ago. The realization made him feel small, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled by an unseen hand. Standing up from his desk, Ethan walked to the window. The manufacturing floor sprawled below, workers moving about their tasks like pieces on a game board. Is that how Grace saw them all? Just pieces to move around at her whim? "Mr. Cole?" His assistant Sarah poked her head in. "Miss Whitmore is here to see you." Ethan's shoulders tensed. "Tell her I'm in a meeting. She says she'll wait." Of course she would. Ethan ran a hand through his hair and nodded. "Fine. Send her in." Grace entered, her usual confident stride somewhat hesitant. She wore a simple navy blazer today, less imposing than her usual power suits. "Ethan, I know you're upset." "Upset?" He kept his voice level, conscious of the thin walls. "That's one way to put it. You dropped money in front of me like I was some kind of lab rat. Then you watched to see what I'd do." "I was wrong about that," Grace admitted, taking a step forward. "But everything after was more of the same." Ethan cut in. "The promotion, keeping my job during layoffs, Maddie's medical bills, you've been pulling strings like some kind of puppet master." Grace's face fell. "That's not fair." "I was trying to help." "Help?" Ethan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You were playing God with my life. Did you ever stop to think how it would feel when I found out? That everything good that happened to me was just manipulation?" "It wasn't manipulation," Grace protested. "I saw someone worthy of help." "Worthy?" Ethan's voice cracked. "Because I passed your little test? What if I had kept the money that day? My daughter needed medicine. Would I have been unworthy then?" Grace stepped back as if she'd been slapped. "No, that's not. I don't need your charity, Miss Whitmore." Ethan turned back to the window. "And I definitely don't need your judgment. Ethan, please." Grace's voice was softer now. "I made a mistake with the envelope. I admit that. But everything else came from a genuine place." "A genuine place?" He turned to face her again. "You didn't even have the courage to tell me it was you helping with Maddie's bills. You let me think it was some anonymous donor. You let me stand up at that potluck and make a fool of myself thanking a stranger." Grace's eyes glistened. "I thought it would be better that way. I didn't want you to feel obligated, but I am obligated, aren't I?" Ethan's voice was tired now. "My job, my daughter's health. It all depends on your goodwill. How am I supposed to feel about that?" Grace took a deep breath. "What do you want me to do? Take it all back?" "Let Maddie. Don't." Ethan's voice was sharp. "Don't use my daughter as a weapon." Silence fell between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Outside, the machinery hummed and voices carried from the floor below, but in the office, the tension was suffocating. "I think you should go," Ethan finally said. Grace stood her ground. "I never meant to hurt you, Ethan. Everything I did was because I saw something special in you, something rare. Something that passed your test, you mean." He shook his head. "Please leave." Grace reached for the door handle, but paused. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not for helping, but for how I went about it." Ethan didn't respond. He heard the door open and close, followed by the click of Grace's heels growing fainter down the hallway. Back in her office at corporate headquarters, Grace sat at her desk, staring at the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The same view that usually made her feel powerful now only emphasized how alone she felt. She pulled up Ethan's employee file on her computer, his ID photo staring back at her. The quiet dignity in his eyes made her chest ache. She'd thought she was doing good, helping someone who deserved it. Instead, she'd wounded his pride and betrayed his trust. Her phone buzzed with messages from her executive team, but she ignored them. For the first time in years, Grace Whitmore, the powerful CEO who could solve any problem with money or influence, felt utterly helpless. On her desk sat a framed photo from the potluck, taken without anyone noticing. Ethan stood with Maddie on his shoulders, both of them laughing. Grace picked it up, running her finger along the edge of the frame. She'd tried to play God in their lives, and now she was paying the price. Setting the photo down, Grace turned her chair to face the window. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city, and she felt every bit as dark as those shadows. She'd pushed too far, tried to control too much. Now she had to live with the consequences. The silence in her office was deafening. The autumn wind whistled through the manufacturing plant's corridors as Ethan methodically went through his end-of-shift routine. His movements were mechanical, his face set in a hard expression that had become familiar over the past few days. Every time he caught a glimpse of Grace's name on company memos or heard her voice in management meetings, his jaw would clench tight. In the break room, he overheard two coworkers discussing an upcoming charity event that Grace was organizing. Without a word, he turned and walked out, taking a different route to avoid passing by her office. The promotion she'd arranged for him now felt like a weight around his neck. Grace watched from her temporary office window as Ethan crossed the parking lot. Her hand lifted slightly, almost waving, but she let it fall back to her side. The distance between them felt vast and growing wider by the day. She picked up her phone several times to call him, but always set it back down. What could she possibly say? Later that afternoon, Grace's assistant knocked on her door. "Mr. Cole asked to be removed from the Special Projects Committee," she said, sliding a form across the desk. He cited personal reasons. Grace's fingers trembled as she signed the release form. Another door closed, another connection severed. She understood his anger. She'd treated his life like some sort of social experiment, testing his character as if she had the right to judge him. At home that evening, Ethan sat at his small kitchen table, sorting through bills. Maddie was coloring nearby, humming softly to herself. A letter from the hospital's billing department caught his eye. It was marked "Paid in Full" with Grace's company logo at the top. His throat tightened as he crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash. "Daddy?" Maddie looked up from her drawing. "How come Miss Grace doesn't visit anymore?" Ethan's heart clenched. "Sometimes sometimes things get complicated, sweetheart. But she's nice." Maddie insisted, pushing her crayon across the paper with more force than necessary. "She helped us." "We don't need help," Ethan said firmly, more to himself than to Maddie. "We're doing just fine on our own." The next morning at work, Grace tried one last time to reach out. She waited by the employee entrance, hoping to catch Ethan before his shift. When he saw her, he stopped short, his expression closing off. "Ethan, please," Grace said softly. "I know I was wrong. But everything since then, the help with Maddie's medical bills, the promotion, it wasn't about testing you. It was because I care." "Care?" Ethan's voice was quiet but sharp. "You dropped money on the ground to see if I'd steal it. You played with my life like it was some kind of game. I don't need your kind of caring." He walked past her, leaving Grace standing alone in the cold morning air. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the full weight of her mistakes. That afternoon, Ethan received a call from Maddie's school. His daughter had collapsed during recess. The school nurse noticed her lips were slightly blue and her breathing was labored. They'd already called an ambulance. Ethan raced to the hospital, his heart pounding. In the emergency room, he found Maddie looking small and pale in the large hospital bed, various monitors beeping around her. The doctor's words blurred together, something about her condition worsening, needing additional tests, possible complications. Grace heard about Maddie's hospitalization through the HR department when Ethan called in for emergency leave. She stood in her office, staring out the window, feeling helpless. Her phone showed Ethan's contact information, her thumb hovering over the call button. But she knew any attempt to reach out would only cause more pain. Later that evening, she drove past the hospital. Through the windows, she could see Ethan's silhouette in Maddie's room, his shoulders slumped as he sat beside his daughter's bed. Grace's vision blurred with tears as she forced herself to keep driving, knowing she had no right to be there, no right to offer comfort or help. Back in her empty house, Grace sat in her darkened living room, the weight of consequence heavy on her shoulders. She'd tried to play God with someone's life, and now she couldn't even help when help was needed most. The distance between them, a distance she had created, felt impossible to cross. In the hospital room, Ethan held Maddie's small hand while she slept. The monitors beeped steadily, marking time in this sterile, white room. A nurse came in to check Maddie's vitals, giving Ethan a sympathetic smile. "There's some paperwork that needs to be filled out," the nurse said gently. "About payment options?" Ethan nodded numbly, knowing he had no answers. He'd rejected Grace's help, torn up the medical coverage papers, determined to make it on his own. Now, watching his daughter's chest rise and fall in the dim hospital light, he wondered if his pride had cost him more than he could afford. Outside the hospital room window, the sun set on another day, casting long shadows across the floor. Ethan sat in the gathering darkness, feeling more alone than ever. In her office across town, Grace sat at her desk, staring at her phone, desperate to help but knowing she'd lost the right to do so. The distance between them had become a chasm, and in the middle lay Maddie, innocent and unwell, paying the price for adult complications neither of them knew how to resolve. The small church stood quiet in the early morning light. Grace's heels clicked against worn wooden floors as she walked down the center aisle, the same church where Ethan had left that envelope months ago. How different things had been then, when she'd watched him from her car, thinking she had all the answers. She slid into a front pew, her designer suit feeling out of place among humble surroundings. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on her clasped hands. "I don't know if I remember how to do this anymore," she whispered, "but I need help." Memories of Ethan's face when he'd discovered her deception haunted her. The hurt in his eyes. How he'd pulled away, protecting himself and Maddie from what he saw as manipulation. "I thought I was testing him," she continued. "But you were testing me, weren't you? And I failed miserably." She pulled out a worn photograph, her lakefront property in Vermont, 3 acres with a gorgeous house she'd barely visited in 5 years, worth millions, but sitting empty. "I've been holding on to things, money, power, control. I thought I could fix everything by pulling strings behind the scenes, but that's not what Ethan needs." The morning light grew stronger. Grace remembered Maddie's innocent smile at the church service, how the little girl had called her an angel. She'd been anything but. "I know what I have to do," Grace whispered. "No more games, no more tests, just truth." She called her real estate agent. "James, list the Vermont property immediately. Be aggressive with pricing, I need it sold quickly." Later that morning, Grace met with her lawyers. The conference room felt sterile as they reviewed paperwork. "You want a what?" her lead counsel asked. "Create a non-profit healthcare facility, right there in town. The Vermont property proceeds will fund it entirely." "Miss Whitmore, this seems rather impulsive." Grace straightened. "I've never been more certain of anything." The lawyers exchanged glances but began drawing up documents. Grace insisted on complete transparency, no hidden agendas, no secret benefactors, just honest help for people who needed it. Leaving the office, Grace passed the manufacturing plant. She could see Ethan through windows, working diligently despite everything. His shoulders were tense, movements mechanical. The weight of Maddie's illness and his pride were crushing him, but he kept going. Grace wanted to rush in and explain everything, beg forgiveness, but she knew better now. This wasn't about making herself feel better. This was about doing right, simply because it was right. She watched Ethan help a coworker with a stuck machine, his natural kindness showing through personal struggles. That was the difference between them. His goodness wasn't calculated or strategic. It was just who he was. Back in her office, Grace began the practical work. She met with contractors, reviewed building plans, started establishing the healthcare facility. Every decision was made with the community in mind, especially those who struggled most to afford care. The Vermont property sale moved quickly. As Grace signed final papers, she felt lighter. The money would do more good here than that empty house ever had. Ethan remained unaware of these developments. Grace saw him occasionally around town, but he always turned away, jaw set. She respected his space. Understanding her earlier actions had broken fragile trust between them. The pride of a good man, her father used to say, can be his greatest strength or heaviest burden. She could see that battle in Ethan, his desperate need to provide for his daughter warring with his inability to accept help that felt tainted by deception. As she watched construction begin on the new medical facility, Grace felt something replacing her pride. Hope. Not hope for forgiveness, but hope that something good could come from her mistakes. The facility would offer state-of-the-art care at minimal cost. It would help not just Maddie, but countless others in similar situations. One evening, reviewing final plans, Grace caught her reflection in the window. The hard lines around her mouth had softened. The calculating look in her eyes had been replaced by something gentler. Maybe this was who she was meant to be all along, before grief and ambition had twisted her into someone else. The woman who tested strangers with dropped envelopes seemed like a stranger now. Whether Ethan ever forgave her or not, She was finally doing something purely good, with no strings attached. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Ethan stared at the official envelope from the town council. His heart thumped as he tore it open. Maddie watched from across the table, spooning cereal. "What is it, Daddy?" Ethan's hands trembled as he unfolded the letter. His eyes scanned the page, and his breath caught. The words blurred as tears welled up. "The Cole Family Care Center," he whispered. "What's that?" Maddie asked, leaning forward. Ethan cleared his throat. "Someone's building a medical clinic in town. They're naming it after your mom." The letter detailed how an anonymous donor had purchased land on Main Street and funded a state-of-the-art medical facility. The clinic would serve families who couldn't afford regular care, providing services at reduced costs or free. "Really?" Maddie's eyes lit up. "Mommy gets her own hospital?" "Something like that, sweetie." Ethan squeezed her hand, remembering Sarah and how she'd always dreamed of running her own clinic. She'd been the kind of nurse who'd stay late and give everything to help others. The letter mentioned a groundbreaking ceremony next week. Ethan's mind wandered to Grace Whitmore. He hadn't seen her since their confrontation, but something about this gift reminded him of her. The timing, the scale, the attention to detail, it all felt familiar. Later that morning, Ethan drove past the construction site. Workers were setting up equipment, preparing the foundation. A large sign announced the future Cole Family Care Center. He parked and walked closer. Several townspeople had gathered, talking excitedly. "Mr. Cole," Pastor Mike called out, "I see you got the letter." Ethan nodded. "Do you know who's behind this?" The pastor smiled knowingly. "The donor wishes to remain anonymous, but they specifically requested it be named after Sarah. They must have known about her dedication." Ethan's thoughts drifted to Grace again. He remembered their conversations, how she'd listened when he talked about Sarah's dream of making healthcare accessible. "The ceremony's next week," Pastor Mike continued. "Sarah would have loved this." "Yeah," Ethan managed. "She would have." Throughout the week, Ethan watched the site transform. Maddie insisted on visiting daily after school, standing at the fence with wide-eyed fascination. "Daddy, do you think Mommy knows about her hospital?" "I'm sure she does, sweetheart," Ethan would reply, holding back tears. The groundbreaking ceremony arrived bright and clear. The site had been transformed with chairs, a stage, and decorations. Ethan and Maddie arrived early, dressed in their Sunday best. The mayor directed them to front-row seats. Hidden behind dark sunglasses, Grace stood at the back, heart pounding. She watched Ethan help Maddie into her chair, straightening the little girl's dress. The sight made her throat tight with emotion. The mayor began his speech about community spirit and accessible healthcare. He spoke about Sarah's dedication, her sacrifice during the tornado, and how the clinic would honor her memory. Ethan sat straight-backed, holding Maddie's hand. Grace could see the tension in his shoulders, how he blinked rapidly to hold back tears. She wanted desperately to explain everything, to make him understand her actions had come from genuine care. The crowd applauded as Ethan and Maddie were called forward to turn the first shovelful of dirt. Grace watched father and daughter grip the ceremonial golden shovel together, their matching smiles bright in the morning Sunday. From her position at the back, Grace could see everything. The pride on Ethan's face, the joy in Maddie's eyes, the supportive smiles from neighbors. She knew this moment marked a beginning, not just for the clinic, but perhaps for healing the wounds she'd caused. As the ceremony concluded, Grace remained watching Ethan and Maddie accept congratulations. She saw Maddie point to the sky, probably telling everyone her mommy was watching from heaven. She noticed Ethan's smile, though genuine, carried uncertainty, as if he was still trying to make sense of this generous gift. Grace watched as Ethan cast one last look at the site before leading Maddie toward their truck, knowing that somewhere in his heart, he must suspect the truth about the anonymous donor. The steady beeping of hospital monitors filled the recovery room where Maddie lay, sleeping peacefully. Ethan sat beside her bed, his large calloused hand gently holding her small one. Dark circles lined his eyes from the sleepless night of waiting, but relief had washed away his exhaustion. Dr. Martinez had just delivered the good news. The surgery was successful. Maddie's heart was stronger now, and with proper care, she would make a full recovery. The words still echoed in Ethan's mind, each repetition lifting another weight from his shoulders. "Her vital signs are excellent," the nurse said softly as she checked Maddie's monitors. "She's one brave little girl." Ethan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "She gets that from her mother." Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across Maddie's peaceful face. Her chest rose and fell with steady breaths, each one a precious gift. The morning light caught the silver cross hanging on the wall, making it shimmer, and Ethan found his thoughts drifting to Grace. He hadn't seen her since their confrontation, but her presence was everywhere in this hospital. The new equipment, the specialized surgical team, the private room, all of it spoke of her invisible hand. His anger had cooled, leaving behind a complicated mixture of gratitude and confusion. Maddie stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. "Daddy?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm right here, sweetheart." Ethan leaned closer, brushing her hair back from her forehead. "Did the angels help the doctors fix my heart?" Ethan's eyes burned with tears. "Yes, baby, I think they did." "Was Miss Grace there too?" The question caught him off guard. "Why do you ask that?" "Because she's one of them," Maddie said simply, her voice heavy with sleep. "One of the angels Mommy sends to help us." Ethan sat back in his chair, his daughter's words settling deep in his chest. He thought about Grace's first test with the envelope of money, how she'd watched him from her car. At the time, it had felt like manipulation, but now he wondered if there had been something more to it, something he'd been too proud to see. The morning passed slowly as Maddie drifted in and out of sleep. Doctors came and went, each bringing more positive reports. Around noon, a flower delivery arrived, a cheerful arrangement of daisies and sunflowers, Maddie's favorites. The card was unsigned, but Ethan knew who they were from. "Mr. Cole?" A hospital administrator appeared in the doorway. "I have some paperwork for you regarding the surgery and follow-up care." Ethan braced himself, knowing the astronomical costs that must be involved. But as he flipped through the pages, he found no bills, no payment plans, no crushing debt. Everything had been taken care of. "There must be some mistake," he said. The administrator shook her head. "No mistake, sir. The Cole Family Care Center covers all pediatric cardiac procedures. It's part of our new community health initiative." Ethan closed the folder, his hands trembling slightly. The Cole Family Care Center, named after Sarah, his late wife. Grace hadn't just helped Maddie, she'd created a legacy that would help countless other families facing the same struggles. He watched Maddie sleeping peacefully, her color better than it had been in months. The anger he'd been holding on to seemed smaller now, less important than the gift of his daughter's health. Grace had tested him, yes, but maybe he'd been testing her too, expecting the worst, refusing to see the good in her actions. A memory surfaced. Grace's face when she'd talked about losing her own child years ago. There had been real pain there, raw and familiar. She wasn't just some cold corporate CEO playing games with people's lives. She was someone who understood loss, who recognized the desperate prayers of a parent afraid of losing their child. "Excuse me," he asked the nurse who was adjusting Maddie's pillows. "Could you stay with her for a while? There's something I need to do." The nurse smiled kindly. "Of course, she's in good hands." Ethan kissed Maddie's forehead and grabbed his jacket. He knew where Grace's office was. He'd avoided the top floor of the corporate building for weeks. But now, watching his daughter breathe easily for the first time in years, he realized he needed to understand, not just about the money or the clinic, but about Grace herself. He straightened his shoulders and headed for the door. It was time for honest answers, not as a CEO and employee, but as two people who had both known love and loss, who had both been tested by life's hardest moments. Grace sat at her desk, staring out the window of her top-floor office. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, and she could see the hospital in the distance where Maddie was recovering. A soft knock at her door made her turn. "Come in," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. Ethan stepped into the office, his work clothes replaced by clean jeans and a pressed shirt. His face was tired but determined. Grace stood, her hands clasped together to hide their trembling. "Mr. Cole, please," he interrupted quietly. "Just Ethan." Grace nodded, gesturing to the sitting area by the window. They both took seats, the leather chairs creaking in the silence. For a moment, neither spoke. "Why?" Ethan finally asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Why did you feel the need to test me that day at the diner?" Grace took a deep breath, her carefully maintained composure cracking. "I've spent years watching people chase money and power. I've seen good people compromise their values for a quick dollar." She paused, looking down at her hands. "I guess I became cynical. I started dropping money, watching to see who would keep it, who would return it, who would pretend they never saw it. Like some kind of twisted experiment." Ethan's voice held a mix of hurt and disbelief. "Yes." Grace admitted, meeting his eyes. But you did something I'd never seen before. You didn't just return it or keep it. You gave it away, trusting that God would make sure it reached the right person. Ethan leaned forward, running a hand through his hair. Do you know how much we were struggling then? That money could have helped with Maddie's medication. I know, Grace whispered, her voice catching. And when I saw what you did, it broke something in me. All my cynicism, all my judgment, it just crumbled. So you decided to play God with my life? The words were sharp, but his tone had softened slightly. Grace stood, walking to the window. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. Every decision I made after that day was messy. Wrong, maybe. I promoted you because I saw your worth. But I did it secretly. I saved your job during layoffs because I couldn't bear to see you suffer, but I did it from the shadows. And the anonymous donations for Maddie's treatment? I couldn't stand by and watch your daughter suffer when I had the means to help. Grace turned back to face him, tears in her eyes. I lost my own daughter 20 years ago. Cancer. All the money in the world couldn't save her. Ethan's expression shifted, understanding dawning in his eyes. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Grace continued, her voice trembling. What I did, testing you, manipulating things behind the scenes, it was wrong. But please believe that everything I did after that first day came from a genuine place of caring. Ethan stood slowly, walking to stand beside her at the window. You know what Maddie said to me this morning? She said she had a dream about her mom, and that Sarah, my wife, told her everything would be okay now. Grace wiped a tear from her cheek, staying silent. I've been so angry, Ethan admitted. Angry about being tested, about feeling manipulated, but maybe, he paused, looking out at the hospital. Maybe sometimes help comes in strange ways. Maybe sometimes the people trying to help are just as broken as the ones they're trying to help. I'm so sorry, Ethan, Grace whispered. He turned to face her fully. I forgive you, Grace. Not because what you did was right, but because your heart ended up in the right place. And because holding on to anger won't help anyone heal. Grace's shoulders sagged with relief, and for the first time in years, she felt the weight of her armor falling away. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the city. The clinic, Ethan said softly. Naming it after Sarah, that meant everything. She saved lives, Grace replied. Now her legacy will continue to save more. They shared a look of mutual understanding, two broken people who had found healing in the most unexpected ways. Through their pain, through their mistakes, through their journey toward forgiveness, something new had begun to grow. Hope. The last rays of sunlight painted the office in warm gold, and in that moment, both Grace and Ethan felt the presence of something greater than themselves. The quiet miracle of healing hearts. The town hall's meeting room buzzed with whispers and speculation. Local reporters clutched their notepads, and community members filled every available chair. Grace Whitmore stood at the podium, her usual commanding presence softened by something different: humility. Thank you all for coming today, she began, her voice clear but gentler than her usual boardroom tone. I have an announcement to make regarding the Cole Family Care Center and my role in recent events in this community. The room fell silent. In the back, Ethan stood against the wall, arms crossed, watching intently. He hadn't expected to be here, but something had drawn him to attend. Many of you know me as the CEO of Healthcare Midwest, but today I stand before you as simply Grace Whitmore, a woman who learned some valuable lessons in this town. She paused, drawing a steady breath. I am the anonymous donor behind the Cole Family Care Center. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several people turned to look at Ethan, whose expression remained carefully neutral. What many of you don't know is that my involvement in this community began with a test I now regret. Grace's fingers tightened on the podium's edges. I deliberately dropped an envelope containing $1,000, wanting to see what someone would do with it. That someone was Ethan Cole. More whispers filled the room. Ethan shifted his weight but didn't move from his spot. Instead of keeping the money, Mr. Cole placed it in the church donation box. His integrity humbled me and began a journey that has transformed my understanding of what truly matters in life. Grace's voice wavered slightly. I tried to help in secret, making anonymous donations and pulling strings behind the scenes. But I realize now that true change requires honesty and transparency. She straightened her shoulders, looking directly at the crowd. That's why I'm announcing my resignation as CEO of Healthcare Midwest, effective immediately. I will be dedicating my time and resources to ensuring the Cole Family Care Center becomes a model for accessible healthcare in rural communities. The room erupted in surprised exclamations. A reporter's hand shot up, but Grace continued speaking. I've learned that real leadership isn't about testing people or manipulating situations from the shadows. It's about standing alongside others, being honest about our mistakes, and working together to make things better. She turned slightly, finding Ethan's eyes in the crowd. I owe this community, and particularly the Cole family, an apology. My intentions may have been good, but my methods were wrong. I hope my actions moving forward will demonstrate my commitment to doing better. Questions burst forth from the reporters, but Grace held up her hand. I'll take questions in a moment, but first, I want to make one thing clear. This center isn't about me or my redemption. It's about honoring the memory of Sarah Cole, a nurse who gave her life saving others, and ensuring that families in this community never have to choose between medical care and putting food on the table. After the press conference, Grace stood in the empty meeting room, gathering her papers. The sound of footsteps made her look up. Ethan approached, his expression thoughtful. "That couldn't have been easy," he said quietly. Grace shook her head. "It wasn't, but it was necessary. Giving up your position, that's a big step. It's the right one." Grace met his gaze. "I've spent too many years measuring success in profit margins and market share. Maybe it's time to measure it in lives helped and communities served instead." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know, when I first found out about the test, I was angry. Felt like you were playing games with my life." "You had every right to be angry," Grace acknowledged. "Maybe." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "But I've been thinking about something the pastor said last Sunday, about how sometimes the greatest blessings come from the most unexpected places." He paused. "What you did for Maddie, for this town, that's going to help a lot of people." Grace felt tears threatening but held them back. "Thank you, Ethan. That means more than you know." "I want to thank you," he said, his voice steady, "not just for Maddie's treatment or the clinic, but for being honest today, for showing us the real Grace Whitmore." She smiled slightly. "I'm still figuring out who that is, to be honest." "Well," Ethan said, extending his hand, "I look forward to finding out." "Fresh start?" Grace took his offered hand, feeling the warmth of forgiveness in his grip. Fresh start. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow across the room. In that moment, both Grace and Ethan knew that whatever came next would be built on truth, not tests, on genuine care, not guilt. The past was behind them, and a new chapter was beginning. The community center sparkled with twinkling lights and cheerful decorations for the town's annual spring celebration. Paper lanterns swayed gently from the rafters, casting warm circles of light across the polished wooden floor. The air hummed with laughter and the gentle melody of live music from the local band. Ethan stood near the refreshment table, tugging at the collar of his freshly pressed blue shirt. He wasn't used to social gatherings, preferring quiet evenings at home with Maddie, but tonight felt different. His daughter sat at a nearby table with her friends from Sunday school, her cheeks rosy with health and excitement. Her recent recovery had given him a new perspective on life and on forgiveness. Grace entered through the main doors, and several heads turned. She looked different tonight, softer somehow. Her usual corporate armor was replaced by a simple, cream-colored dress, her hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She paused uncertainly at the entrance, clearly feeling out of place. Their eyes met across the room. Ethan felt his heart skip a beat, remembering their conversation from earlier that week. The raw honesty of her confession, the genuine remorse in her eyes when she'd explained everything. He raised his hand in a small wave, and relief flooded her features as she made her way toward him. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Ethan said quietly as she approached. Grace smiled, though nervousness flickered in her eyes. "I almost didn't. It's different being here now that everyone knows." The townspeople cast curious glances their way. News of Grace's identity as the clinic's benefactor and her resignation from the healthcare conglomerate had spread quickly through their small community. Some still viewed her with suspicion, others with newfound respect. "Would you like some punch?" Ethan offered, gesturing to the crystal bowl on the table behind him. "That would be nice, thank you." As he poured her a glass, the band transitioned to a slower song. The melody was sweet and familiar, an old hymn arranged as a waltz. Several couples moved onto the dance floor. Grace sipped her punch, watching the dancers. "It's beautiful, isn't it? How music can bring people together." Ethan nodded, studying her profile. In the soft lighting, he could see past the powerful CEO to the woman beneath, someone who had lost as much as he had, who understood loneliness and regret. "Would you?" He hesitated, then gathered his courage. "Would you like to dance?" Surprise flickered across Grace's face, followed by a gentle smile. "I'd love to." They moved onto the dance floor, maintaining a respectful distance at first. Ethan's hand settled carefully at her waist, while hers rested lightly on his shoulder. Their free hands clasped, and they began to move with the music. "I'm probably a bit rusty," Ethan admitted. "Haven't danced since." "Since Sarah?" Grace asked softly, referring to his late wife. He nodded, feeling the familiar ache. But it was different now, more of a gentle remembrance than a sharp pain. "I haven't danced in years either." Grace confessed, "Not since. Well, not for a long time." As they swayed to the music, the initial awkwardness began to fade. Their movements became more natural, more in sync. The distance between them gradually diminished until Grace's head was nearly resting on Ethan's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For giving me a second chance. For showing me what real integrity looks like. For helping me remember who I used to be before I let the corporate world harden my heart." Ethan's hand tightened slightly on her waist. "We all deserve second chances, Grace. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us of that." They continued dancing, lost in the moment and the music. The other dancers, the watching crowds, even the decorated hall seemed to fade away. There was just the two of them, moving together, finding healing in each other's presence. From her table, Maddie watched them with wide eyes and a knowing smile. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her favorite stuffed angel tucked beside her. The surgery scar on her chest was still pink and new, but her eyes sparkled with renewed energy. As the song drew to a close, Ethan and Grace slowly stepped apart. Their hands remained linked for a moment longer than necessary, neither wanting to break the connection completely. Maddie approached them, her steps light and sure. She looked up at Grace with pure affection, then reached for her hand. Grace knelt down to the little girl's level, her eyes growing misty. "Mommy says thank you, Miss Grace," Maddie whispered. The soft music from the band filled the community center as Ethan and Grace found a quiet corner away from the dancing crowds. They settled into two chairs near a window where moonlight streamed in through the glass, creating a peaceful atmosphere around them. Grace smoothed her navy blue dress, her fingers fidgeting with the fabric. "I never thought I'd be here," she said softly, glancing at Ethan. "In this town? At this celebration? With you." Ethan nodded, understanding written across his features. "Life has a way of surprising us." He watched Maddie across the room, giggling with her friends. Sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in her lap. "Ethan, I need to tell you something." She took a deep breath, her professional facade crumbling to reveal something more vulnerable. "I'm scared. The last time I let someone into my life, I lost them." Ethan turned to face her fully, his eyes gentle. "I know about loss too," he said quietly. "After Sarah died, I thought that was it for me. I focused everything on Maddie because it was safer that way." "How do you do it?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do you open yourself up again, knowing how much it can hurt?" "One day at a time," Ethan replied, his voice steady and reassuring. "That's all any of us can do. When Sarah first passed, I couldn't even think about tomorrow. But then Maddie needed me to be strong, and somehow the days kept coming." Grace wiped at the corner of her eye. "I had a daughter," she revealed, the words catching in her throat. "Emma, she was only 6 when—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Ethan understood. "Is that why you helped us?" he asked gently. Grace nodded. "Partly. When I saw Maddie, something in me just broke open. But then I got to know you, and it became about more than just memories or guilt. You showed me what real integrity looks like, Ethan. You taught me about faith when I thought I'd lost mine completely." Ethan reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "We don't have to figure everything out tonight, Grace. There's no rule book for this. I'm not used to not having a plan," Grace admitted with a small laugh. "In my world, everything has to be calculated, measured, controlled." "Maybe that's exactly why this feels right," Ethan suggested. "Because for once, we're both just letting life unfold naturally." Grace squeezed his hand. "When I first dropped that envelope, I thought I was testing you, but God was really testing me, wasn't he?" teaching me about real kindness, about letting go of control. He works in mysterious ways, Ethan agreed with a slight smile. But Grace, we can take this as slow as you need. There's no pressure here. Grace looked at him gratefully. You're very patient. I've learned that the best things in life can't be rushed, he said, glancing again at Maddie. Like watching a child grow, or healing from loss, or, he paused, meeting Grace's eyes. Learning to trust again. I want to try, Grace said firmly, despite the tremor in her voice. I want to be brave enough to take this chance. With you, with Maddie, with all of it. Ethan smiled warmly. Then we'll try together, one step at a time. One step at a time, Grace repeated, letting out a long breath. I think I can manage that. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the dancers twirl across the floor. The music shifted to a slower song, and Ethan stood up, still holding Grace's hand. Speaking of steps, he said with a gentle tug on her hand, would you like to take a few with me? Grace looked at the dance floor, then back at Ethan. I haven't danced in years, she admitted. Neither have I, he confessed. We can be terrible at it together. A genuine laugh escaped Grace's lips, and she stood up. Well, when you put it that way. They moved to the edge of the dance floor, finding their own small space among the other couples. Ethan placed his hand respectfully on Grace's waist, and she rested hers on his shoulder. As they began to sway to the music, the awkwardness of their first steps gradually melted into something more natural. You're not terrible at all, Grace murmured. Don't sound so surprised, Ethan teased. Gently. I do have a few hidden talents. I'm learning that, she replied softly. As they danced, Grace felt some of her fears beginning to loosen their grip. She wasn't the same person who had dropped that envelope all those months ago. That Grace had been cynical, closed off, using her power to test others because she couldn't trust anyone. But here, in Ethan's arms, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Thank you, she said suddenly. For what? For showing me that it's okay to let people in again? For helping me remember what really matters? Ethan's eyes crinkled with understanding. Thank you for reminding me that sometimes the biggest blessings come disguised as challenges. Even when they start with dropped envelopes. Grace laughed softly, resting her head against his shoulder as they continued to sway. They didn't need to say anything else. They both knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, one step at a time. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site of the Cole Family Care Center. Grace stood at the edge of the property, her usual business attire replaced by jeans and a simple blouse. She watched as workers maneuvered beams into place, the skeleton of the building taking shape against the autumn sky. Ethan approached, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. His weathered hands were covered in sawdust from helping with the woodwork earlier. Thought you might need this? He said, offering her one of the cups. Thanks. Grace wrapped her fingers around the warm cup, breathing in the familiar aroma. It's really happening, isn't it? Sure is. Ethan's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. The crew says we're ahead of schedule. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the construction progress. A few townspeople walked by, waving warmly at both of them. Grace noticed how different their greetings felt now. Gone were the suspicious glances and whispered conversations. Instead, she saw genuine smiles and heard cheerful good mornings. Mrs. Thompson asked if you're still coming to help with the church bake sale this weekend. Ethan mentioned, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. She says your apple pie is becoming quite famous. Grace laughed, shaking her head. Who would have thought? The corporate CEO learning to bake from the church ladies. They've adopted you, Ethan said softly. Just like the rest of us have. The weight of his words settled around them, warm and reassuring. Grace remembered how different things had been just months ago. The loneliness of her corner office, the emptiness of her achievements. Now, her days were filled with community meetings, volunteering at Maddie's school, and working alongside people who had become true friends. Speaking of adoption, Grace said, Did you see Tommy's face when we finished his treehouse yesterday? Ethan nodded, grinning. Tommy was a local boy whose single mother worked 2 jobs. Grace had noticed him watching the clinic construction every day after school and had somehow ended up promising to help build him a treehouse. What started as a small project had turned into a community effort, with Ethan leading the construction and other volunteers pitching in. You're good with kids, Ethan observed. They trust you. They're honest, Grace replied. No hidden agendas, no corporate politics. Just Pure hearts. A worker called out to Ethan, needing his expertise with some electrical work. Before heading over, he touched Grace's arm gently. Want to grab lunch later? Maddie's been asking about having a picnic at the park. I'd love that, Grace said, warmth spreading through her chest at the simple invitation. As Ethan walked away, Grace pulled out her phone to check her emails. There were several from her old corporate contacts, asking about business opportunities and board positions. She declined them all, knowing her place was here now. The clinic wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of transformation, both for the town and for herself. Later that afternoon, Grace sat cross-legged on a checkered blanket in the park, watching Maddie chase butterflies nearby. The little girl's laughter carried across the grass, pure and unreserved. Ethan unpacked sandwiches from a worn cooler, the same one Grace had seen him use for his work lunches months ago. "Miss Grace!" Maddie called out, running back to them. "Look what I found." She held out a perfect dandelion puff. "Make a wish," Grace encouraged, and Maddie closed her eyes tight before blowing the seeds into the air. They watched them float away on the breeze, carrying whatever secret wish the child had made. "What did you wish for, sweetie?" Ethan asked, handing his daughter a juice box. "Can't tell." Maddie giggled. "But it's about you and Miss Grace." Grace caught Ethan's eye, and they shared a knowing look. Children saw things so clearly sometimes, understood truths that adults often complicated. As they ate their lunch, several townspeople stopped by to chat. Mrs. Baker brought over fresh tomatoes from her garden, insisting Grace take them home. The high school principal discussed plans for a mentoring program at the clinic. Even gruff old Mr. Jenkins, who had once been Grace's harshest critic, tipped his hat as he walked by. "Remember when everyone thought I was here to shut down the plant?" Grace mused, watching the people pass. "You proved them wrong," Ethan said. "You proved a lot of people wrong, including me." "I proved myself wrong too," Grace admitted. "I thought I knew what success looked like. Corner office, power suits, board meetings. But this," she gestured to the park, the people, the simple picnic. "This is real success." Ethan reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. The gesture was natural, comfortable, like everything else that had grown between them. There was no need to rush, no corporate deadlines to meet. Their relationship had developed at its own pace, built on a foundation of truth and understanding that had emerged from their earlier conflicts. Maddie came running back, flopping down between them on the blanket. "Can we get ice cream?" "What do you think?" Ethan asked Grace, his eyes twinkling. "I think," Grace said slowly, pretending to consider it carefully, "that ice cream is exactly what this perfect day needs." They packed up their picnic and walked together toward the old-fashioned ice cream parlor on Main Street. Grace noticed how naturally Maddie's small hands slipped into hers, how easily they fell into step together. The townspeople they passed no longer saw her as the intimidating CEO who had tested their beloved Ethan. Instead, they saw her as Grace, the woman who helped at church functions, who read stories at the library, who was building a clinic to help their children. Inside the ice cream shop, Maddie pressed her nose against the glass, examining each flavor with serious concentration. The owner, Betty, beamed at them from behind the counter. "The usual for all of you?" The fact that they had a usual order made Grace's heart swell. She watched as Betty scooped vanilla for Ethan, chocolate chip for Maddie, and butter pecan for her. Such a simple thing, being known, being part of something. As they sat at the small round table by the window, Grace realized she had found more than redemption in this town. She had found a home, a family, a purpose that went beyond profit margins and corporate success. The rhythm of her days now moved to a different beat. One measured in morning coffees with Ethan, afternoon stories with Maddie, and evening walks through a town that had become her own. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings as crowds gathered in front of the Cole Family Care Center. Crisp red and white balloons bobbed against the clear blue sky, their ribbons dancing in the wind. The building stood proud and pristine, its modern facade gleaming in the morning light. Ethan adjusted his tie nervously, standing at the edge of the makeshift stage. He'd borrowed the suit from his neighbor, and though it was a bit tight around the shoulders, he wanted to look his best for this moment. Beside him, Maddie bounced on her toes in her favorite yellow dress, her brown curls neatly tied back with matching ribbons. "Daddy, look how many people came!" Maddie tugged at his sleeve, her eyes wide with excitement. Grace appeared beside them, elegant in a simple blue dress that made her look softer, more approachable than her usual corporate attire. "The whole town's here," she said, smiling warmly at Ethan. "They're all here to celebrate something wonderful." The mayor stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone. The crowd's chatter died down as he began his speech about community spirit and new beginnings. Ethan barely heard the words, too focused on the way Grace's hand had found its way into his, their fingers intertwining naturally. "And now," the mayor announced, "I'd like to invite Miss Grace Whitmore and Mr. Ethan Cole to cut the ribbon." They stepped forward together, Maddie skipping ahead of them. The large red ribbon stretched across the clinic's entrance, a symbol of all they'd overcome to reach this moment. Grace handed Ethan one handle of the oversized scissors, and together they positioned them against the ribbon. "Ready?" Grace whispered. "Ready?" Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. The scissors sliced through the ribbon with a satisfying snip, and the crowd erupted in applause. Maddie jumped up and down, clapping her hands. "We did it! We did it!" As the applause continued, Ethan caught sight of the plaque beside the entrance. "The Cole Family Care Center," it read, and below that, "In loving memory of Sarah Cole, Angel of Mercy." His late wife's name caught the sunlight, and, for a moment, he felt her presence, warm and approving. The doors opened, and people began filing in for the open house tours. The interior smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. The waiting room was bright and cheerful, with colorful murals on the walls and comfortable seating. A play area in the corner already had several children exploring the toys. "It's beautiful," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah would have loved this." Grace squeezed his hand. "She's here with us, in every detail. The pediatric wing, the emergency care unit, the family counseling services, DI. It's all designed to help families like yours." They walked through the halls together, greeting community members and showing off the facilities. The pride in Grace's eyes matched the gratitude in the townspeople's faces. She'd transformed from the distant CEO into someone they knew and trusted, someone who had given them hope. Later in the afternoon, as the formal celebrations wound down, families gathered in the park next to the clinic for a community picnic. Tables laden with homemade dishes stretched across the grass, and the sound of children's laughter filled the air. Maddie ran off to join a group of kids playing tag, her yellow dress fluttering behind her. Her cheeks were rosy with health and excitement, so different from the pale, tired little girl she'd been just months ago. The sight made Ethan's heart swell with gratitude. "She looks so happy," Grace observed, stepping close to Ethan's side. "She is happy. We all are." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Thank you, Grace. Not just for the clinic, but for everything. For showing me that sometimes it's okay to accept help, that being strong doesn't mean doing everything alone." Grace's eyes softened. "You taught me more than I taught you, Ethan. You showed me what real integrity looks like, what it means to have faith even when things seem impossible." She glanced at the clinic, then back at him. "This place isn't just about healing bodies, it's about healing hearts too." They found a quiet spot under an old oak tree, spreading out a checkered blanket on the grass. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow around them. From their vantage point, they could see Maddie playing with her friends, her laughter carrying across the park. Mrs. Johnson from the church brought them plates of food, fried chicken, potato salad, and her famous apple pie. "You two deserve to rest and enjoy," she said with a knowing smile. "We'll take care of everything else." The community had come together in ways Ethan had never expected. The clinic wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of hope, of second chances, of love that grows in the most unexpected places. He watched as Grace chatted with some of the townspeople who stopped by their blanket, her corporate mask completely gone now, replaced by genuine warmth and ease. The afternoon mellowed into evening, the sun beginning its descent behind the trees. The crowd had thinned, but several families remained, their children making the most of the remaining daylight. Maddie was still running around with her friends, her energy seemingly endless. Ethan felt Grace's hand slip into his again, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the scene before them. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, casting a gentle glow over everything. The new clinic stood proudly against this backdrop, its windows reflecting the warm light. "This feels like home," Grace said softly, leaning her head against Ethan's shoulder. "It is home," he replied, squeezing her hand gently. "For all of us." They watched as Maddie chased fireflies with her friends, her laughter pure and free. The worry lines that had creased Ethan's forehead for so long had softened, and Grace's eyes held a peace that had been missing for years. Together, they had built something beautiful, not just the clinic, but a foundation of trust, understanding, and love. The golden light of sunset wrapped around them like a warm embrace as they sat hand in hand, their hearts full and at peace. The sweet summer air carried the promise of many more evenings like this one, of a future filled with shared moments and simple joys. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Ethan Cole, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.